The iron brand hissed in Rome's forum, 3 letters FVG carved into a girl's forehead. That scar was not rage, it was bookkeeping. Rome's glory wasn't paid in marble or coin, it was bought in bodies. Especially the bodies of women who dared to run. So who really paid for Rome's order? Not the generals or the senators. It was the fugitiva, branded at dawn, the slave chained at the villa gate. The woman turned into theatre for beasts. The laws wrote invoices for pain, turning escape into debt and resistance into spectacle. Chronicles recorded triumphs, but bones, scars, and charred iron tell the missing account. If you value the record history, tried to erase, subscribe. Because when the ledger closes, the bodies still speak. Her name was Claudia, 19 years old, born on a Campanian estate, sold into Rome at 14. For 5 years, she scrubbed floors, poured wine, endured the merchant's son in the dark. Then she ran. 3 days of fragile freedom, sleeping in olive groves, stealing bread, memorizing alleyways. She almost reached the port before the Vigiles caught her. Now she kneels in the forum, the iron kissing her skin, and the crowd cheers as if cruelty were a civic duty. Claudia's punishment wasn't unusual, it was the point. Rome depended on fear to keep millions in chains. Every branded woman became a warning sign, a living advertisement of consequences. The empire's economy relied on this choreography branding for first escape flogging or gate chains for the second arena death or mines for the third. A system refined over centuries, cruel not by accident but by design. This is the story Rome never meant to preserve, how women who tried to flee became both property and performance, punished until their bodies turned into Rome's unspoken archives. Capture was the beginning. But in Rome, beginnings were never simple. For women and girls, slavery arrived like a net cast over their lives, sometimes sudden, sometimes woven over years, until they realized they had already been caught. One path was violence. Armies on campaign did not just take land, they harvested people. In the smoking aftermath of sieges, soldiers separated survivors by sex and age. Men were killed quickly or marched away for military labor. Women and children especially, those young enough to bear children, were corralled. Captivity began at the edge of a burned village, wrists bound with rope stripped of possessions, marched to ports where Roman traders waited. The price of a woman could be calculated even before she spoke a word of Latin. Her age, her hips, her teeth, her silence. These were the columns in Rome's living ledger. Another path was debt. A poor family in the provinces, unable to pay a tax collector or moneylender, might surrender a daughter as collateral. To Roman accountants, this was not cruelty, but commerce. The girl became a pledge, and when repayment inevitably failed, the pledge was absorbed. She vanished into the chain of property, no less bound than if soldiers had taken her. The euphemism was neat contract instead of capture. But the result was the same. A child lost, a life sold. And for many, there was no moment of taking at all because slavery was their birthright. Roman law made enslavement hereditary through the principle of partus sequitur ventrem. The child follows the womb. A woman enslaved meant her children enslaved. Infants opened their eyes already owned. This created a hidden economy inside households. Every girl's body represented not only present labor, but future stock. her fertility was as valuable to her master as her hands. Once seized, debt-bound, or born into chains, the transformation was swift. Names were the first thing stripped away. The Greek girl Helena became Cressa, reduced to a label for her island. A Gallic teenager became Lusca, if she squinted Rufa, if her hair was red. The new name functioned as both brand and erasure, denying her the dignity of family and ancestry. Identity dissolved into utility. From there, bodies entered the marketplace. At Rome's slave markets, the Subura district, the Forum Boarium provincial auction blocks, women and girls were displayed like livestock. Auctioneers yanked tunics to expose teeth, and skin-checked hips for signs of childbearing forced them to walk in circles while buyers appraised gait. Paperwork followed receipts, tax ledgers inventories. The law itself called them res things. A purchase of a girl was recorded in the same registers as a wagon or an ox. The cruelty lay not only in the sale, but in the logic behind it. Women were priced differently from men, not because they worked less, but because they worked doubly. Labor in the fields or kitchens, and labor of the womb. A girl of 15 was a dual investment capable of domestic service, now reproductive service soon. The market premium reflected this calculus. Auctioneers bragged about proven breeders, enslaved women who had borne multiple healthy children, their offspring already thriving in another household. Buyers studied such records the way horsemen studied stud books. For the enslaved themselves, the sale was rupture. Children torn from mothers' sisters, split apart kin, scattered so thoroughly that even memory became dangerous. Roman traders calculated family separations as strategy. Bonds of affection might breed escape attempts. Dispersal bred dependence. Each woman arrived in her new household, isolated with only the overseer's gaze to anchor her. Behind this machinery of capture and sale was an economic truth. Enslaved women were not just laborers, they were renewable capital. Purchase one woman, and if she survived, you might gain 3, 4, or 5 children. Purchase a man, and you acquired one set of hands. Purchase a woman, and you acquired a womb, a lineage of future workers. The balance sheet leaned heavily toward exploitation of female bodies, and Rome knew it. We tend to imagine empire as marble arches and military triumphs. But Rome's wealth also rose from invisible foundations. The girl taken in war, the daughter surrendered to debt, the infant born already enslaved. They became the commodities that are no monument records yet. Every monument required. The forum's temples, the villas of Campania, the aqueducts striding across hills, all these stood on backs bent by labor and on wombs conscripted without consent. Claudia, the branded girl we met in the forum, once walked this path too. She was not unique. She was typical. Sold at 14, she entered a system that saw her not as person, but as potential worker, potential mother, potential punishment. Her escape attempt was rebellion, not only against a master, but against the entire economic logic of Rome. The ledger of Rome's greatness contained 2 currencies, stone and flesh. And for enslaved women, flesh was always the cheaper, more expendable coin. The iron glowed white against the coals, its letters already cut deep into metal. FVG. Fugitiva. Runaway. In the Roman Forum, punishment was never private. Merchants paused their haggling children, craned their necks, and travelers gathered in a semicircle around the platform. What they witnessed was not only the pain of one woman, but the reinforcement of an entire system. Branding was the empire's most intimate declaration of ownership, a mark designed to outlast memory itself. The executioner called the carnifex lifted the iron for all to see. The woman knelt on the stone wrists, bound two assistants holding her still. She was young, perhaps 18, and her defiance was written in posture more than words. Rome did not care about her name. From the moment the brand touched flesh, she ceased to be Claudia or Livia or any of the thousands of women who tried to run. She became the word carved into her face, fugitive property example. The sound came first, sharper than any scream, the hiss of flesh meeting metal. It cut through the forum's background hum of carts and bargaining like a knife through parchment. Then came the scream, high and raw, carrying past the baker's stall and across to the steps of the basilica. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see better, not shielded from the horror. This was civic education. Rome wanted its citizens to understand freedom belonged only to them. For everyone else, even hope was punishable. The mark itself mattered less than its placement. For men, branding on the arms or shoulders might be hidden beneath a tunic. Women, however, bore their brands on the forehead, the one part of the body impossible to disguise. Veils could not fully conceal it. Hairstyles could not hide it. Each trip to market, each act of service, every glance from stranger or neighbor began with the scar that spoke louder than her own voice. It was a sentence of social death that outlasted the pain of the iron. Roman law was explicit in its cruelty. The 12 tables treated fugitives as thieves because by running they had stolen themselves. The punishment was not imprisonment, which would waste labor, but transformation, turning the body into a billboard. The scar ensured there would be no second attempt without instant recognition. Neighbors, guards, and fellow slaves could spot fugitives before the thought of escape even took form. Rome perfected deterrence by burning punishment into the skin. The brutality carried economic logic. Branded women sold for less on the market, but they still sold. A buyer knew exactly what he was purchasing. Damaged goods. Yes, but also a servant whose will had been broken, whose rebellion had been priced into the sale. In surviving auction ledgers, scholars find marginal notes, FVG, 30% reduction. Her humanity, reduced to discount her resistance, converted into market arithmetic. Yet the empire also calculated the spectacle itself as profit. A single branding in the forum warned thousands. The scar was not only permanent on her body, it engraved itself into the minds of all who watched. Rome understood that terror multiplied when witnessed. The pain of one woman became a system of control over tens of thousands. Archaeological evidence echoes the texts. Skulls unearthed in Spain show. Healed forehead burns the bone itself, warped by heat. Inscriptions from household accounts mention fugitives branded, for example. Even satirists joked about slaves who wore their crimes on their brows. The casualness of the references is almost more chilling than the punishments themselves. What was horror for the victim became background detail for society. For the branded woman herself, the punishment never ended. Infection often followed untreated by salves or bandages. Scars thickened, sometimes ulcerated, turning letters in targes of pain. The mark bled into every interaction. Freeborn citizens stared, fellow slaves avoided her eyes, children whispered. For the rest of her life, every mirror, every basin of water, every polished bronze surface reminded her of the day she was renamed by fire. And still, some tried again. Records mention women branded more than once, their foreheads crisscrossed with letters like a palimpsest of defiance. Others chose death rather than live branded. Roman writers record suicides in prison cells or in fields, women preferring the oblivion of the grave to the permanent reduction of their identity. Yet most endured because survival, even branded, sometimes meant keeping children alive or staying close to loved ones. Rome believed the brand was betrayal. Betrayal of master of household, of the legal fiction of property. But in truth, the betrayal lay with the empire itself, a civilization that called itself just, while burning letters into the bodies of women. The scar was meant to erase defiance, but it did the opposite. Each mark whispered of a will that once refused to be owned. Each letter stood not only for fugitiva, but for the fragile, flickering insistence that life could be otherwise. When we read the word FVG carved into bone, we read both Rome's triumph and its deepest shame. For in the silence of the branded forehead, history records the empire's secret glory was bought with the flesh of the nameless, and every mark was a ledger entry of betrayal. Rome's betrayal of its own claim to civilization. At dawn, before the city's bustle had fully awakened visitors, approaching certain Roman villas were met, not by marble statues or painted frescoes, but by a living body affixed to the gate. The woman was suspended by iron collars and brackets, her arms spread wide, her feet barely scraping the stone threshold. She did not hang as a criminal awaiting execution. She hung as ornament, as warning, as living punctuation to the master's authority. This was the Porta Supplici, the gate of punishment. The practice was no invention of cruel whim. It was a refinement in Rome's theatre of power. Branding left scars, flogging left welts, but gate punishment left a woman visible, every hour of the day transforming her into an architectural feature of humiliation. Guests arriving for banquets stepped over her body. Merchants delivering goods brushed past her ragged frame. Fellow slaves carrying amphorae or laundry walked by with eyes fixed straight ahead, torn between pity and self-preservation. Her suffering was not meant to be hidden. It was meant to become part of the household's facade. The engineering was precise. Archaeological excavations at villas near Pompeii and Ostia have revealed iron brackets set at shoulder height, positioned in doorways where chains would naturally stretch a body into permanent strain. Too high, and the victim might suffocate too quickly. Too low, and she might rest. The goal was neither quick death nor mercy. It was prolonged exposure, muscles tearing slowly, joints swelling with inflammation, a body forced to remain alive so long as it could endure. Roman authors wrote of this with unnerving casualness. Petronius in his Satyricon joked about lazy slaves who might end up as door ornaments. Martial penned epigrams mocking servants displayed at gates as warnings. What comedy for the elite was agony for the enslaved. For women, the cruelty carried an additional sting. They had to endure not only the physical torture, but the invasive gazes of every visitor, their degradation displayed as civic theatre. Weather deepened the torment. In summer, the sun baked exposed skin until blisters rose, flies clustering around open sores. In winter, rain drenched clothing until hypothermia set in every gust of wind, turning damp fabric into ice. Guards rarely allowed shelter. Suffering had to remain on display. Some women lasted days, others weeks. Few survived long enough to return to labor, and those who did bore permanent damaged shoulders, wrenched from sockets, hands twisted into claws, spines bent into grotesque arcs. The gate's psychological impact may have been more corrosive than the physical. For other enslaved people, the message was unavoidable. Pass this threshold. See what disobedience earns. To ignore her was to suppress natural empathy. To acknowledge her was to risk suspicion of solidarity. Rome engineered not just the woman's torment, but the emotional fracture of the community around her. The gate became a site of silence, where fellow slaves swallowed grief and fear behind blank faces. Sometimes the punishment extended into grotesque variations. Wealthy men, like Marcus Crassus, reportedly rotated punishments, branding on one day gate, chaining on another flogging stage midweek, ensuring that the entrance to his home never lacked spectacle. Guests praised his discipline, as though cruelty were evidence of refined management. The irony is difficult to miss. The very threshold through which senators and philosophers walked discussing law and virtue was decorated with human suffering, a grotesque inversion of Rome's ideals of civilization. Children too were drawn into the performance. Elite families often brought their sons and daughters to villas, where gate punishments occurred. For young Romans, these living displays became moral lessons. Obedience yields safety. Defiance yields spectacle. The normalization was complete. When children laughed imitating the bound figure, or asked whether they might own one someday, the cruelty reproduced itself across generations, not only through law, but through the quiet pedagogy of daily exposure. Evidence of these punishments survives in stone. Certain villa entrances contain iron fixtures in precisely those positions, their wear patterns consistent with chains pulled taut by human weight. In some cases, skeletal remains have been found near thresholds' bones, twisted in ways that suggest prolonged suspension. These finds confirm what literature hinted at, and what common sense already knew. The gate was not metaphor. It was hardware for torture. For women enduring this punishment, time itself became an enemy. Each hour brought greater strain. Sleep was impossible. Food was rationed to prolong life. Water withheld to hasten delirium. Some hallucinated, calling out to children or whispering prayers to forgotten gods. Others went silent. Eyes, vacant bodies, still enduring, though spirit already broken. Social death preceded physical death. Even when released, they returned as ghosts among the living reminders of a fate too terrible to speak aloud. But Rome was not content with the silence of its victims. A herald often announced their crime: attempted escape, theft, disobedience, refusal of sexual access, so that no passerby mistook the punishment for arbitrary cruelty. Law turned agony into spectacle, spectacle into lesson, into power. The woman herself disappeared into this machinery. Her name erased her voice irrelevant. Only the message mattered. Rome does not forgive defiance. Yet paradox clings to the image. For while the gate was meant to erase individuality, it inadvertently preserved it. Every scarred threshold, every rusted bracket, every skeleton found in twisted posture tells us that these women existed. They were not shadows, but people as real as the senators who dined inside, and the philosophers who pontificated about virtue. The gate of shame was meant to silence them. Instead, it left traces strong enough to speak across 2 millennia. In Rome, the whip was not just an implement of pain. It was a stage prop, an instrument of theatre, a tool designed to transform one woman's suffering into a collective lesson. flogging was never a private matter. It was ritualized performance carried out in courtyards, workshops, and open-air markets where dozens of eyes would watch and remember. To the Romans, cruelty only worked if it was witnessed. The instrument itself reflected this philosophy. The flagellum was no simple strip of leather. It was engineered with chilling precision oxhide straps, weighted with bronze or lead balls, sharpened bone fragments, sometimes even shards of glass braided into the cords. Each strike combined blunt force with tearing edges. The weights bruised deep into muscle, while the fragments ripped flesh open. This wasn't random violence. It was technology refined across generations to maximize pain without always killing. Unlike citizens who faced legal limits on how many lashes could be given enslaved, women had no ceiling. The law was silent on their suffering. A sentence could last until the flogger tired, until the overseer was satisfied, or until the victim collapsed into unconsciousness. That silence in the legal code wasn't oversight, it was intentional. It made the enslaved woman's body an open canvas for whatever punishment a dominus or magistrate chose to paint upon it. The ritual usually began with preparation that itself served as humiliation. A woman might be stripped to the waist, tied to a pillar, or suspended by her arms from an overhead beam, her body stretched to expose every surface. The onlookers' fellow slaves, neighbors, children of the household were compelled to attend. Looking away risked accusation of sympathy. So they stared because survival demanded it. This created a theater where fear was the script and silence was the only applause allowed. The first blows cut clean lines across the skin. After 10 or 20 strikes, flesh began to split and peel. The whip whistled through the air with a rhythm that made each impact seem inevitable, like the beat of a drum in a funeral march. Women screamed at first, then sobbed, then made only the guttural noises of bodies too exhausted to resist. Sometimes the only sound in the courtyard was the wet thud of leather and metal against skin. Medical care was almost never provided afterward. The wounds were left open, deliberately exposed to infection. Salt or vinegar might be rubbed into the cuts not as medicine, but as punishment. The raw back became both scar and warning visible, proof of disobedience etched into the body for all to see. Some women carried layered scar tissue leathery ridges across their shoulders and ribs testimony to repeated lessons. Their bodies became living archives of violence. And yet, the whip's purpose was never simply to hurt the individual. It was to shape the collective. The courtyard audience absorbed the message. This could be you. The scarred woman served dinner, carried water-nursed children, while her wounds wept through her tunic, her back a walking reminder of what defiance cost. Even when the pain faded, the sight of her body kept fear alive in others. Rome understood that punishment worked best when it multiplied. Writers of the time referenced flogging with unsettling casualness. Juvenal mocked wealthy women who had their slaves whipped for arranging their hair poorly. Martial joked about lashes as if they were minor inconveniences. Their words revealed just how normalized the spectacle was. Violence was not hidden. It was folded into daily routine, into comedy, into education. Roman children grew up watching whippings, as others might watch plays, their moral lessons written in blood. The flagellum, with its cruel blend of weight and edge, was the empire's most reliable teacher. It didn't just scar the body. It trained obedience. It reinforced hierarchy. It dramatized the absolute difference between citizen and slave, between dominus and woman, bound to a post. And the silence of the law guaranteed that the theater of the whip could continue unrestrained, day after day, courtyard after courtyard. Rome perfected the art of making pain public. In doing so, it turned punishment into performance, and women into unwilling actors whose suffering provided the moral script for an empire built on fear. The whip was terror for the household. The arena was terror for the city. Rome took cruelty and scaled it up, building amphitheaters where pain became spectacle, where the suffering of enslaved women turned into the mourning program for tens of thousands. If flogging was a lesson whispered within villa walls, the arena was a sermon shouted across the empire. Women condemned for escape attempts theft, or simply for defiance, were often reserved for the cruelest act of all damnatio ad bestia's condemnation to the beasts. But Rome rarely left death as a simple execution. Instead, it clothed it in myth. On the morning of her final day, a woman might be dressed as Andromeda, chained to a painted rock as a sea monster. Really, a half-starved lion lurched from its gate. Another might be Prometheus bound, while an eagle tore at her flesh. Sometimes she was Pasiphae mocked with grotesque props, or Callisto hunted as prey. In each case, Rome's myths were made flesh, real bodies standing in for characters real, death serving as entertainment. The engineering was astonishing. Beneath the arena floor pulleys and elevators lifted women into sudden daylight. Painted backdrops turned sand into rocky coasts or mountain crags. The props were elaborate, but the women were not actors. They were consumables. A costumed slave didn't know whether the gate would open to reveal a stag for decoration or a panther trained to kill. The suspense wasn't just for the crowd, it was for the victim too. Audiences leaned forward, children perched on their fathers' shoulders as if watching a play. Only this was theatre where the script was written in screams. Musicians accompanied the scene, with drums and flutes heightening the drama. Announcers narrated the myths, turning each death into a moral tale. Defiance punished, order restored. To Roman ears, it wasn't murder, it was mythological justice divine will enacted on sand. The cruelty lay not only in the kill, but in the delay. Sometimes the beasts were drugged to make them sluggish, forcing women to stand for agonizing minutes, awaiting the inevitable. Other times animals were starved for days, ensuring frenzied attacks. A lion's first swipe might not kill, only cripple. The woman would crawl bleeding as the crowd roared approval. And yet the audience didn't see themselves as watching slaughter. They saw education. Parents brought their children to teach them Roman discipline. Philosophers attended writing in journals about divine order and civic strength. Executions weren't entertainment alone, they were pedagogy. Every scream reminded citizens of their freedom, their safety, their superiority. Every bloodstain reinforced the hierarchy on which Rome stood. For the enslaved, the arena was terror doubled. It was not only death, but also humiliation. Being forced to reenact Andromeda's helplessness or Prometheus's torment stripped women of their last dignity. They were turned into symbols, tools to tell Rome's stories. And when they died, they left not just corpses, but memories etched in every spectator's mind. Disobedience equals destruction. Writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded these events with matter-of-fact detail. They described the costumes, the staging, the novelty acts. Sometimes women dressed as goddesses, mauled mid-ritual. Marshall even joked about the artistry of executions, praising clever staging as if reviewing theatre. Behind their words lies the reality: women's deaths were choreographed by professionals who knew exactly how to make agony into art. Archaeology confirms what the texts describe. Substructures of amphitheatres show lifts and cages designed to release animals with perfect timing. Graffiti depicts bound women facing lions. Bones found in arena drains bear marks of both shackles and teeth. Rome's most celebrated monuments, the Colosseum, the amphitheatre of Capua, the arenas scattered across the provinces, are not only architectural triumphs, they are cemeteries of the enslaved. To the crowd, each execution ended in applause. To the empire, it ended in silence. The woman's name vanished. No record marked her existence, except perhaps a receipt of purchase, a tally of condemned bodies for the games. Yet her death served the system. It entertained the people, reinforced the hierarchy, and reminded every enslaved woman in Rome what awaited those who tried to run. The arena sand was soaked with more than animal blood. It bore the stories of women turned into myths against their will. Their suffering transformed into parables of obedience. Rome called it justice. We might call it something else: civilization built on spectacle, and humanity sacrificed to feed its roar. If the arena was spectacle, the mines were oblivion. Rome did not always kill its disobedient slaves in daylight, before the roar of a crowd. Some it consigned to darkness, where there would be no applause, no stories, not even a record of their names. The sentence was called damnatio, in metallum condemnation, to the mines. It was the slowest and most complete form of erasure the empire could devise. A woman condemned to the mines would begin her punishment with a journey. Shackled at the wrists and neck, she was marched in a human chain across provinces. Roman roads that carried armies and merchants also bore these silent processions, women, men, sometimes children, all linked in iron. Onlookers recognized them instantly: the gaunt faces, the chafed ankles, the eyes already hollowed by knowledge of what lay ahead. Some collapsed en route. Guards cut corpses loose and left them by the roadside. The chain moved on. Arrival brought descent. Roman mines were not engineered with human survival in mind. They were engineered to extract ore. Shafts were narrow, sometimes no wider than a body. Tunnels snaked unpredictably, following veins of copper, silver, or gold. Ventilation was poor. Air thickened with dust and poison. Torches sputtered in the damp, painting walls with flickering shadows that made orientation impossible. For those condemned, day and night lost all meaning. Women labored in gangs chained together to prevent escape. 6, 8, sometimes 10 bodies moving as one. When one stumbled, all fell. When one collapsed and died, the rest dragged her carcass until the guards cut it away. Tasks varied: hauling ore, pounding rock with iron hammers, carrying baskets of spoil up steep shafts. None were suited for women already weakened by branding, flogging, or childbirth. Rome didn't care. Bodies could be used until they broke. Replacements were endless. Pregnancy offered no reprieve. Women gave birth underground, chained to their companions. There are accounts of infants delivered in the dust, their first breath filled with metal particles, their first cry swallowed by darkness. Some were strapped to their mothers' backs as she resumed work within hours. Most died quickly. The mines consumed not only the women sent there, but the children born into its shadows. The mines were engines of profit as much as punishment. Sardinia's silver, Spain's copper, Egypt's gold all enriched Rome's treasury and lined the purses of senators who owned shares in operations. The condemned women were as much part of this machinery as the ore carts and pickaxes. They were not meant to survive long enough to be remembered. 2 years was considered a remarkable span. Most perished within months. The conditions were not secret. Roman writers mention them with a mixture of awe and horror. Pliny the Elder described the mines as monstrous places that shortened lives to nothing. Yet the empire did not reform them. Efficiency mattered more than mercy. The saying among overseers was simple: the mine always wins. Archaeology confirms this grim truth. Excavations in Spain and Sardinia have uncovered mass graves of chained skeletons, women and children still linked at the ankles. Some bear marks of malnutrition, others show lesions from lead poisoning. In one collapsed shaft, an entire chain gang was found entombed, their bones pressed together in the posture of people who had fallen as one and never risen again. Unlike the arena, there was no crowd to gasp at these deaths. The mines erased people in silence. They stripped away individuality, dignity, even time itself. A woman sent below ground became a shadow, her body eaten by dust and exhaustion until she was indistinguishable from the rock she chipped away. This was Rome's most complete punishment. Branding marked the body floggings, scarred the back. The arena erased dignity, but the mines deleted existence. To send someone in metallum was not only to punish them, but to remove them from memory. Even the law referred to it as a sentence without return. And yet, each shovel of ore carried out of those shafts bore witness. Every ingot of silver, every gold coin stamped with an emperor's face, carried within it the invisible weight of women who had labored and died unseen. Rome's splendor above ground was built on a subterranean graveyard. In the darkness of the mines, women did not become myths like in the arena. They did not become living warnings like at the villa gates. They became nothing at all, or so Rome intended. But bones endure where records fall silent. Today, their remains speak for them, telling us that beneath the empire's wealth lies an abyss of human lives deliberately forgotten. If the mines represented Rome's method of deletion, the law of inheritance ensured that slavery reproduced itself in plain sight. Rome devised a rule that was both brutally simple and monstrously effective. Partus sequitur ventrem, the child follows the belly. It meant that no matter who the father was, whether free citizen senator or emperor himself, the child of an enslaved woman was born enslaved. The chain of bondage was not broken by birth, it was renewed. This legal principle turned enslaved women into factories of human property. Their bodies were not only exploited for labor or sexual use, but also transformed into engines of perpetual supply. An estate did not need to purchase new slaves if its women were fertile. Pregnancy was encouraged not for the health of the mother, but for the increase in numbers on the balance sheet. Children were profits in swaddling cloth. For the children themselves, slavery began before memory. A newborn was immediately classified as res a thing, not a person. Records survive where infants appear not as names, but as tallies. 1 male, 3 months healthy. 1 female, 2 weeks weak. They were entered into inventories like livestock, their future value already calculated. Daughters were marked for domestic work or sexual service, sons for field labor or sale. Some infants were branded in early childhood iron, pressed to tender skin to deter flight decades before escape was even possible. The stigma of maternal branding carried forward too. A woman scarred with the letters F.G. fugitiva runaway bore children who lived under suspicion. Masters assumed rebellious blood ran in their veins. These children were often surveilled more harshly, punished more quickly, and sold more readily. Market documents note this bias explicitly. Offspring of fugitiva, lower price possible risk. Even before they had acted, they were condemned by their mother's defiance. Family bonds, when they managed to form, were systematically broken. Infants might remain with their mothers for a few months, but separation was routine. A baby could be sold off to another villa before it learned to walk. Roman authors described this as practical management, avoiding the dangerous attachments that might breed solidarity. In truth, it was psychological warfare. A mother's grief was wielded as a weapon to keep her compliant. Children grew up without kin, their earliest lessons not of family, but of surveillance, scarcity, and obedience. Some children were raised deliberately for sale. Roman slave markets prized house-born slaves called verni who had never known freedom. Merchants touted them as loyal, docile, and well-trained. A girl born in captivity might fetch a high price as a domestic servant precisely because she had no memory of liberty. No kin to mourn, no language, but that of command and submission. The ideal verna was a blank slate, ready to be inscribed with the will of an owner. Others were groomed for specific roles from an early age. A daughter with beauty was pushed toward sexual service. Her grooming began in childhood, her body policed and shaped for a role she did not choose. A boy with strength was trained for fieldwork or the workshop. Childhood games became rehearsals for adult exploitation. Toys, when given mirrored labor tools, miniature spindles, small baskets, mock whips. Play itself was colonized by the system that owned them. But cracks in this machinery did exist. Some enslaved mothers whispered forbidden stories to their children, memories of a village, a river, a lost language. These fragments of identity could not be completely extinguished. Archaeologists have found graffiti scratched by slave children in villa walls, drawings of boats, stick figures, holding hands, crude prayers to unknown gods. These marks are tiny acts of resistance proof that even within absolute control, children dreamed of something beyond the walls. The cruelty of inherited bondage lay not only in what it imposed, but also in what it denied. Roman law made sure that no child born to a slave woman could testify against a master, inherit property, or claim citizenship. They were born outside the civic community, excluded from the rights that defined personhood. Their fate was sealed before their first breath. And yet Rome depended on these children. They replenished the labor force, staffed the kitchens, filled the mines, and when their mothers' scars were visible, served as living reminders of the system's permanence. A branded woman's daughter might spend her entire life in bondage, but her very existence confirmed the arithmetic Rome had written into law: women produced property, and property produced wealth. For every Claudia who bore the letters of punishment, there were children who inherited the invisible chains those letters represented. The Roman world called this efficiency. We call it what it was: a generational curse inscribed not only on skin, but into the very structure of society. If the law of inheritance guaranteed Rome a perpetual labor force, the law of ownership guaranteed men absolute rights over enslaved women's bodies. Sexual violence in Rome was not a crime against an enslaved person. It was not even acknowledged as violence at all. It was an extension of property rights. Roman law drew a sharp line: rape required the victim to be a free citizen. Enslaved women could not by definition be raped. They could only be used. This created a chilling reality. Every aspect of an enslaved woman's body was a resource: her hands for labor, her womb for reproduction, her sexuality for profit or pleasure. She could not refuse. Consent, as we understand it, was a concept denied to her. A master's decision was the law. His desire was her fate. Roman jurists wrote of ius vitae necisque, the right of life and death, a dominus held over his property. Between life and death stretched an entire spectrum of permissible abuse. Sexual exploitation was not an aberration, but a structural function of the system. Owners routinely kept women as concubines, or lent them to guests as a form of hospitality. Others forced them into prostitution for revenue, a practice so common it formed a distinct sector of Rome's economy. Brothels across the empire were stocked with enslaved women, their earnings flowing directly into the pockets of their owners. The state taxed these establishments, profiting from what was essentially institutionalized sexual slavery. The reproduction of slaves was treated as an investment strategy. Young women, especially those in their early teens, were forced into pregnancies that increased their owners' holdings. Each birth added to the estate's value. Records list women by their fecunditas, their fertility rate, as if they were breeding animals. Medical texts describe ways to induce conception or control menstruation, written with cold detachment tools for maximizing property output rather than ensuring health. The brutality went beyond economics. Enslaved women carried the psychological weight of knowing that their children were not their own. A daughter might be sold to a brothel at puberty. A son might be auctioned for farm labor. Even pregnancies resulting from assault were not grounds for compassion, they were investments. Some estates functioned almost like breeding farms, where women were cycled through pregnancies until their bodies collapsed from exhaustion or infection. For the women themselves, sexual vulnerability was inescapable. The oikos, the household, was both workplace and prison. Kitchens, bedrooms, and nurseries all offered opportunities for violation. A woman serving wine could be ordered to a master's bed. A nurse caring for a Roman child could be harassed by the child's father or brothers. Even moments of supposed intimacy were weaponized as reminders of her status. She was never outside the reach of demand. The cultural silence surrounding these practices reveals their normalization. Roman writers, when they mention sexual use of slaves, do so casually, almost as if discussing the quality of olive oil or livestock. Martial jokes about masters enjoying their maids. Juvenal mocks wives for resenting their husbands' affairs with household slaves. The cruelty lies not only in the acts, but in how unremarkable they were considered. And yet these silences are also telling. Rarely do sources preserve the voices of enslaved women themselves. We know of their suffering through law codes' estate records and the satirical comments of elite men. But archaeology offers fragments of testimony. In Pompeii, graffiti reveals the prices of enslaved women in brothels. In graves, the skeletal remains of girls show signs of early childbirth and pelvic trauma. These bones, like whispers, expose what the texts tried to make invisible. The system's genius was that it turned individual suffering into collective infrastructure. An enslaved woman's body could be exploited in multiple ways at once, as a worker, as a mother producing new slaves, as a prostitute generating cash, as a concubine cementing social bonds. Every function reinforced the others. Rome had devised not only a political empire, but an empire of flesh, where the female body was a resource to be consumed until it broke. To Rome, this was order. To us, it is evidence of a society that legalized violation as a norm. The absence of the concept of rape for enslaved women speaks volumes about whose dignity counted and whose did not. Behind the marble statues and polished rhetoric of philosophy, countless unnamed women endured lives defined by forced availability. Their stories remind us that the foundation of Roman power was not only conquest abroad, but domination within the household walls. Punishment in Rome was not random cruelty. It was a calibrated system designed to terrify control and profit. Branding, flogging, chaining at gates, sending women to beasts or to mines. All of these were not isolated acts, but parts of a single economy of terror. Rome had perfected the art of suffering as infrastructure. At its core was deterrence. Every punishment had a double audience, the victim herself and all who watched. A branded forehead warned other enslaved people not to run. A chained woman at the villa gate reminded her comrades that the household's walls were also instruments of pain. A flogging in the courtyard turned one woman's broken body into a living poster for obedience. The arena, with its staged myths and bloody deaths, multiplied fear on a civic scale. And the mines where women vanished into darkness and poison became the whispered endgame of disobedience. Economics sharpened this system. Punishments were expensive, and Rome ensured that expense created value. Brands had to be forged by smiths. Chains and collars required ironworkers. The flagellum with its oxhide straps weighted with lead bone or glass was a product of specialized craftsmanship. Each arena execution required a full team: animal handlers, set, designers, musicians, executioners. Mines needed overseers, guards, and engineers to drive tunnels deeper. Even cruelty generated jobs, industries, and streams of profit. Owners calculated punishment as they might calculate crop yields. A young, healthy woman might be branded rather than executed because she still had years of labor value. A repeat fugitive might be flogged rather than sent to the mines, preserving her usefulness while still terrorizing others. The logic was cold but efficient. Maximize utility, minimize rebellion. Rome's legal codes provided the blueprint, but estate managers and magistrates made daily calculations of pain versus profit. Public spectacle amplified this logic. When a woman was flogged, it was not done in private. She was bound in the courtyard before her peers. Children were forced to watch. Looking away risked punishment. The community was made complicit, absorbing terror into their bones. Likewise, arena executions served not only as entertainment, but as state propaganda. The mythological plays Andromeda chained to the rocks, Prometheus devoured by the eagle, were morality tales teaching that defiance of order led to annihilation. Violence became theater, terror became education. This machinery extended into urban planning. Rome's streets contained spaces built for punishment, the forum for brandings, the villa gates for chained displays, the amphitheatre for mass executions, the shafts of Sardinia and Numidia for erasure. Infrastructure and cruelty fused until they were indistinguishable. Villas were not just homes, they were theatres of dominance. Cities were not just markets and temples, they were also stages for disciplining the enslaved. The scale of the economy is staggering. Consider the supply chains. Mines required iron for chains, leather for whips, lead for weights, animals for the arena imported from Africa and Asia. Each link was funded by Roman taxation, each transaction binding suffering into the empire's wealth. To own slaves was to participate in this economy. To govern was to regulate it. Terror was not only psychological, it was financial, legal, logistical. And yet, within this system, cruelty adapted to necessity. In harvest season, punishments might be delayed to keep hands in the fields. During festivals, executions were scheduled for maximum audience. Even suffering was seasonal, bent to Rome's rhythms. The state did not merely allow cruelty, it managed it with bureaucratic efficiency. For enslaved women, this meant living inside a perpetual calculus of fear. Every act from serving wine to glancing at a door carried risk. Any misstep might move them one rung down the ladder of punishment brand whip chain, beast, mine. Terror was cumulative, designed to keep them suspended in obedience without extinguishing their labor too quickly. Rome's genius lay not only in its aqueducts and armies, but in its cruelty made systematic. Terror was not chaos, it was policy. The empire ran on grain taxes and fear, all harvested with equal precision. And at the center of that machinery stood the enslaved woman's body, scarred, chained, displayed, erased. She was at once the victim and the proof, the worker and the warning. The foundation of an economy where suffering itself became Rome's most reliable resource. If terror was the engine of Rome's slave system, law was the blueprint that made it possible. The whips, brands, and chains were not the products of chaos. They were the outputs of a legal machine that codified cruelty into everyday governance. Rome did not stumble into brutality. It wrote brutality into statute. At the foundation stood the 12 Tables. Rome's earliest legal code, etched in bronze in the mid-5th century BCE. In them, the enslaved appear not as people, but as property. Theft of a slave was punished like theft of livestock. A runaway slave was categorized as a thing stolen from its rightful owner. Later, jurists gave this doctrine a chilling phrase, furtum sui, theft of oneself. To attempt escape was not an act of self-liberation, but a crime against property law. From this premise flowed Rome's entire legal architecture. The owner, the dominus, possessed dominium, absolute authority over his human property. This power was nearly total. The right to command, to punish, to sell, to lend, to kill. In the eyes of the law, an enslaved woman's body was no more her own than a plough or an ox. Her womb, her labor, her very name, all fell under her master's ledger. Consider sexual violence. For a Roman woman of citizen status, rape was a crime prosecuted by the state, though even then often framed as an offense against her father or husband's honor rather than her own personhood. For an enslaved woman, rape did not exist in law. Objects cannot consent, and property cannot be violated by its owner. A master could use an enslaved woman sexually, could lend her to guests, could force her into prostitution in a brothel, all with the full protection of law. Even when children resulted, the principle of pater sequitur ventrum, offspring, follow the womb, ensured that the child inherited the enslaved mother's status, automatically enriching the owner. Violence thus became profit-sanctioned by statute. Testimony offers another window into this legalized dehumanization. Roman courts only admitted the testimony of enslaved people if it was extracted under torture, a practice known as basanos. The reasoning was explicit. Slaves were inherently deceitful and could only tell the truth under pain. This legal doctrine institutionalized the whip and the rack as tools of jurisprudence. To hear an enslaved woman's voice, the law demanded that it be wrung from her body through agony. Even punishment itself was bureaucratized. A branding was not merely an act of cruelty. It was a legal sentence documented and entered into municipal records. The letters FVG branded on a woman's forehead for fugitiva were a permanent legal status marker, akin to a passport or tax seal. Similarly, flogging sessions were often ordered by magistrates, not merely by private masters, transforming the courtyard into a courtroom where pain doubled as documentation. And the law's silences spoke volumes. There were no statutes limiting the number of lashes an enslaved woman could endure, no protections against mutilation, no maximum sentences for gate chaining. Citizens had limits. Fines, exile, even executions capped at certain procedures. Slaves had none. The absence of restraint was itself a form of codified permission. This legal scaffolding reveals Rome's paradox. The same civilization that produced brilliant jurists, Cicero, Gaius Ulpian, also produced statutes that erased entire categories of humanity. The jurisprudence that influenced European law for centuries was built in part on the normalization of treating women as things. Property law expanded contracts, refined torts, elaborated, all while millions of enslaved women lived and died as test cases in a system that codified their silence. But Roman law did more than regulate slavery. It normalized it. By embedding enslavement into contracts, inheritance law, taxation, and even religious obligations, Rome ensured that no citizen could live entirely outside this economy. When a senator manumitted a slave, he did so through notarized documents that recorded liberation as an exception to ownership. When a temple acquired enslaved attendants, it filed receipts ensuring divine service was legally accounted property. When estates sent women to the mines, municipal registries logged their departure, as one might log the transfer of grain. In this way, law did not simply reflect brutality, it dignified it. Pain became a transaction. Ownership became justice. Silence became statute. The blueprint was complete. A society where cruelty was not an accident, but a contract signed and sealed by the authority of Rome itself. Rome's greatness was not only built in marble and law, but also in words. Yet, when it came to slavery, especially the suffering of enslaved women, their words faltered, circling truth, but rarely confronting it. In the literature of empire, we glimpse paradox recognition without reform, empathy without action. Philosophy, side by side with screams. These voices survive, not as advocacy, but as echoes caught between silence and complicity. Take Seneca, Nero's tutor, and one of Rome's most celebrated Stoic philosophers. In his letters, he wrote, "They are slaves. No, they are human beings," a line that rings with moral clarity. And yet Seneca himself owned hundreds of enslaved people, including women branded for flight. His advice was not to free them, but to treat them with a certain measured kindness, so that they may serve more willingly. He condemned anger, but his tranquility depended on the systemic terror of others. The paradox is haunting philosophy that proclaimed universal humanity coexisted with the day-to-day reality of women chained at the gate. Juvenal, the satirist, carved his cruelty into poetry. In one verse, he describes a woman ordering her slaves flogged for the smallest mistake in hairstyling. His intent may have been ridicule of elite excess, but the detail reveals a truth. Violence against enslaved women had become such a norm, it could be used for a punchline. Laughter mingled with lashes. Martial writing epigrams for Rome's literate classes joked about slaves branded on the forehead, about bodies turned into living property marks. His wordplay dances on the surface of unimaginable pain. What shocks is not only the cruelty, but the casualness. Pain was entertainment, not outrage. Even in tragedy, enslaved women's voices are fractured. Euripides, centuries earlier, gave lines to captive women, lamenting their fates, their lost children, their violated bodies. But these laments were safely contained in the theatre, a ritualized catharsis that allowed audiences to weep at fictional grief, while ignoring the real women grinding grain or nursing their masters' infants. Stage tears did not spill into streets. The philosophers too displayed this cognitive split. Aristotle had argued centuries before that some people were slaves by nature, bodies designed to serve. Later thinkers refined the idea that slavery was not only useful, but necessary for the leisure of citizens who could then pursue philosophy. This intellectual scaffolding allowed the system to endure unquestioned. How could Claudia's screams compete with the polished sentences of men whose reputations would echo through universities for millennia? Yet beneath the silence, hints of recognition flicker. Petronius, in his Satyricon sketches, grotesque banquets where slaves are humiliated as part of spectacle, his irony biting enough to suggest discomfort. Pliny the Younger mentions masters who mistreated their slaves and expresses distaste, but he stops short of condemning the institution itself. The limits of elite imagination appear again and again, critique of cruelty, but never of the chains themselves. This selective empathy is itself a kind of violence. To notice scars, but not question the whip. To describe branding with wit, but not horror. To philosophize about anger while ignoring the daily terror sustaining one's household. It reveals what scholars call cognitive dissonance, a culture able to see injustice and yet justify it through necessity, tradition, or convenience. And here lies the deeper tragedy. Enslaved women's own voices are absent. They did not write treatises. They could not publish epigrams. Their testimony, when preserved, comes through the filter of torture in courtrooms or through hostile pens of satirists. Silence becomes their legacy, not because they had nothing to say, but because Rome ensured their words did not survive. Their stories surface only in fragments. A curse tablet written by a desperate enslaved woman appealing to the gods for vengeance. An epitaph commissioned by a master for a favored servant's skeletal remains, showing the physical toll of repeated childbirth. These fragments whisper where the philosophers kept quiet. The coexistence of brilliance and brutality in Roman letters teaches a harsh lesson: culture can polish cruelty until it gleams. Poetry can disguise pain. Philosophy can rationalize oppression. Laughter can normalize atrocity. And silence, perhaps most of all, can drown out screams. Rome's voices remembered themselves. They forgot Claudia. When the voices of the enslaved were silenced, their bones remained. Rome's poets and philosophers might have framed cruelty as necessity or comedy, but the ground kept its own records. Archaeology has become the counter-chronicle, revealing what literature erased. Skulls, shackles, scars etched into skeletons. These are testimonies no censor could suppress. Excavations across the former empire tell the story in fragments. In Spain, a burial site revealed human remains with burn scars on the forehead bone, the letters FVG, faintly preserved in calcium. Branding meant to vanish the person into property instead, etched into bone, a message that outlived Rome itself. In Sardinia, at the sites of imperial mines, archaeologists unearthed mass graves of chained women and children. Skeletons still locked together by rusted iron collars and shackles found in narrow shafts where collapse had buried them alive. The mine. Rome's final erasure ended up preserving what texts ignored: that women gave birth, labored, and died in darkness, their children swallowed with them. In villas around Campania and Latium, iron brackets fixed into stone entrances have been discovered, their placement too deliberate to be decorative. At human height, they bore the marks of chains rubbing stone smooth. Some still contained rust fused with bone fragments, silent proof of the gate punishment. What Roman comedy mocked as door ornaments becomes undeniable fact when architecture itself testifies. These fixtures were not metaphors. They were instruments of prolonged torment built into the very facades of wealth. Forensic studies of skeletons add more layers. Analysis of women's remains shows repetitive stress injuries, grooves on shin bones from endless carrying of water jars, worn vertebrae. From lifting loads, dental enamel worn down from constant grinding of grain. Many skeletons reveal evidence of repeated pregnancies, beginning in adolescence with complications untreated. Others show trauma ribs broken and healed, suggesting beatings survived. These silent bodies map lives of exhaustion and violence. Archaeological finds also expose scale. In Britain, a site at York revealed dozens of skeletons bearing violent injuries, decapitations, broken jaws, stab wounds. Many were non-local women and children transported as slaves to distant provinces. Isotope analysis of their teeth traced origins as far as North Africa. Rome's slave economy was not confined to the Mediterranean. It stretched across continents, scattering human remains like tributaries of empire. Sometimes bones carry unexpected testimony. In one burial near Pompeii, the skeleton of a young woman was found with shackles still locked around her ankles. She was buried hastily, perhaps by someone who feared her unchained body would speak of defiance. In another case, archaeologists found curse tablets near slave quarters, tiny lead sheets inscribed with desperate appeals to underworld gods. The enslaved could not speak in courts, but they wrote to the dead, leaving prayers for revenge pressed into soil. Bones and curses together whisper truths the chronicles refused. These remains also highlight the hypocrisy of Rome's polished monuments. The same empire that built aqueducts and amphitheaters also engineered shackles to fit women's necks with mathematical precision. The same society that perfected road networks also perfected the logistics of transporting chained bodies across them. The stones of the Colosseum, admired today by tourists, once absorbed the blood of women forced into mythological pageants, where death was disguised as theatre. Bones and ruins speak in duet, exposing the price of splendor. And perhaps the most haunting testimony comes not from individual remains, but from absences. Entire mine complexes reveal thousands of tools, yet only a fraction of human remains. Where are the rest? Collapsed tunnels still hold them. Countless women erased so thoroughly, their bones remain unreachable. The silence of absence is itself evidence of scale. Modern science continues to amplify these mute witnesses. DNA analysis confirms maternal lineages cut short. Pathology reveals diseases born of confinement, malnutrition, and sexual exploitation. Archaeology, unlike ancient literature, does not flinch. It preserves suffering in bone and iron, presenting us with evidence that demands recognition. Rome's writers told us one version, the witty epigram, the philosophical maxim, the theatrical satire. But the earth has written its own record. Each scarred skull, each rusted chain, each mass grave says what Rome tried to bury, that its greatness was inseparable from systematic cruelty. The bones speak now because the women could not then. They testify across centuries, asking not for pity, but for memory. Rome's empire eventually fell, but its methods of control did not. The technologies of punishment, the legal doctrines of ownership, and the cultural logics of terror migrated into new societies. The continuity is chilling. The brand on a woman's forehead, the chain at the villa gate, the inheritance of slavery through the mother's womb, these patterns echo far beyond antiquity. When European colonists built plantations in the Caribbean and the American South, they resurrected Rome's system almost blueprint for blueprint. Branding irons were used again, searing initials into the flesh of enslaved Africans to mark ownership. Plantation ledgers mirrored Roman account books, noting not only labor output, but reproductive capacity. Women were classified by age, fertility, and breeding potential, just as Roman estates had logged menstrual cycles and childbearing histories. What Rome pioneered as an economic logic of the womb reappeared in a transatlantic register multiplied across continents. The principle of partus sequitur ventrem, the child follows the womb, resurfaced in colonial law. Enslaved mothers produced enslaved children, ensuring generations of bondage. A rule designed in Rome became a cornerstone of American slavery. The cycle of inherited servitude was not accidental, but calculated. It made women's bodies factories of wealth. Just as Claudia's children bore her stigma, enslaved women in the Americas, Moors saw their offspring born into chains. Even the theatre of cruelty remained. Rome staged arena executions as entertainment. Centuries later, public whippings of enslaved people in marketplaces and squares served the same purpose. In both cases, violence was not hidden, but displayed to educate spectators about hierarchy. Scarred backs in Charleston or Havana carried the same warning message as scarred foreheads in the Roman Forum. Disobedience equals destruction. The mines too had their afterlives. Rome's damnatio in metallum condemned women to toxic shafts. In the colonial world, enslaved labor was driven into silver mines at Potosi and goldfields across Brazil. Mortality rates rivaled Roman precedents. Bodies consumed until nothing remained but exhausted corpses. Archaeologists at Potosi find skeletons of women and children bearing the same patterns of joint stress and mineral poisoning as Roman remains. History had turned a vicious circle. Even Rome's normalization of sexual dominion endured. Owners in the American South, the Caribbean, and Brazil claimed enslaved women as sexual property. Reproduction became economic expansion. Consent was legally impossible. The echoes are so direct, they read as plagiarized cruelty. When owners in Virginia or Barbados loaned enslaved women to guests, they were repeating Roman hospitality customs that treated women's bodies as tokens of generosity. The cultural double standard persisted as well. Roman matrons were confined to domestic spaces while their husbands claimed lovers' slaves and prostitutes. Plantation mistresses were likewise trapped in households forced into silence as their husbands assaulted enslaved women. Patriarchy excused male indulgence while punishing female resistance with exile, death, or humiliation. Across centuries, the double standard remained absolute. Even in more modern institutions, the shadow lingers. The logic of surveillance and deterrence branding, flogging public punishment, resonates in prison systems where bodies are marked, chained, and displayed as examples. The language of property and productivity still clings to human life in systems of trafficking, forced labor, and carceral exploitation. When we read of detainees producing cheap goods, or victims of trafficking treated as disposable commodities, we hear Rome's voice echoing across 2 millennia. The persistence is not accidental. Rome built a model of domination so efficient that later societies copied it, sometimes consciously, sometimes through inherited legal frameworks. Roman law influenced European legal codes, which in turn shaped colonial systems. The techniques became cultural muscle memory violence, rationalized, humanity, erased, profit, prioritized. And yet across these centuries, the same paradox remained. Rome praised virtue while practicing cruelty. Colonial societies spoke of liberty while chaining millions. Modern nations proclaim human rights while tolerating trafficking. The chain stretches unbroken, each link forged in denial. Bones remind us of Rome's cruelty, but legacies remind us it was never only Rome. The structures outlived the empire, embedding themselves in the very systems that followed. What began in the forum, the villa and the mine shaft, persisted into plantations, auction blocks, and prison yards. The methods change form, but the logic endures power, rights law, and the powerless are made into property. To understand Rome is to understand ourselves, because its legacy lives in modern chains. The question is whether we will recognize those echoes, or continue to excuse them as the cost of civilization. Claudia's story began with fire against flesh, a brand meant to erase her personhood, to reduce her forever to property. Rome intended the letters FVG to proclaim her as fugitiva, a runaway, a warning to every other enslaved woman who might dare to imagine escape. But across centuries, that brand does more than mark her as property. It marks her as human someone who refused to accept degradation as destiny. In Claudia's scar, we glimpse the paradox of Rome itself. An empire celebrated for its architecture, law, and philosophy also perfected the architecture of cruelty, the law of erasure, and the philosophy of domination. It proclaimed civilization while normalizing barbarity. It built aqueducts to carry water while sending women to mines to die of thirst. It raised temples to justice while branding justice into human flesh. Claudia was one among millions, her story an emblem rather than an exception. Her children inherited her chains. Her body produced profit. Her pain produced obedience. And her silence produced the myth of Roman greatness. Yet, within her choice to run, even for 3 days, there lies the seed of resistance. Every branded forehead, every scarred back, every chained body at the villa gate testified not only to Rome's cruelty, but to a human will that refused to vanish. Archaeology confirms what texts tried to obscure. excavated skulls with branded bone skeletons chained together in mines, punishment fixtures built into villa gates. These are the physical voices of the Claudius Rome wanted us to forget. Bones are not silent. They whisper of suffering and resilience of women who endured and resisted in ways too dangerous to record in writing. Literature gives us glimpses too, though filtered through Roman eyes. Satirists joked about branded slaves. Philosophers preached kindness without freedom. Poets used enslaved women as metaphors. Yet, the lived reality of Claudia and her sisters exceeds satire and philosophy. It forces us to reckon with the human cost of civilization's triumphs. What do we remember when we admire Rome? Do we see the arches and the marble? Or do we hear the screams at the Forum branding block? Do we read Seneca's meditations on virtue while forgetting the branded women who served at his banquets? Do we imagine gladiators in shining armor without recalling the enslaved women forced into mythological deaths in arenas? Claudia compels us to look again, to see the invisible labor, the silenced voices, the bones beneath the monuments, to recognize that what we call civilization is always paid for by someone. The question is, who? Her story resonates because its echoes are not gone. Modern trafficking, forced labor prison exploitation. These are the new forums and mines, the new brands and chains. When we hear of women coerced into sexual slavery or families broken by labor systems, we are hearing Rome again. We are hearing Claudia's brand echoing in modern flesh. But memory can be a form of justice. To speak Claudia's name is to defy the erasure Rome intended. To imagine her life beyond the brand is to restore humanity to the dehumanized. She becomes more than property, more than punishment, more than a statistic in a ledger. She becomes a woman who chose, who resisted, who mattered. The final lesson is not only historical, it is ethical. Civilizations are not judged by the roads they build or the laws they codify, but by how they treat the powerless. Rome failed that test. The question remains, will we, when the ledger of empire closed, Rome's monuments survived, but Claudia's voice did not? It is up to us to restore it, to remember not just the emperors and philosophers, but the branded women who bore the real cost of glory, to honor them not as property, but as people. The brand on Claudia's forehead meant fugitiva. To Rome it meant shame. To us, it can mean something else: courage. The courage to refuse the unacceptable, to dream of freedom, even when chains are certain to carry humanity through inhuman times. Claudia ran. She paid the price. Rome thought it silenced her. But in telling her story, we prove otherwise. Her mark endures not as Rome's warning, but as her testimony. And through her, we remember them all.